you hear me? All right. And we have enjoyed him in the past. Tonight he will tell us about the French and Indian War. I personally look forward, as you all do, to this presentation because in school I always thought history was my best subject. The opinion of my teacher might be otherwise, but as I reflected on this subject, I was lost. So let's get on with it. We are pleased to announce Guy Morin.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Does anybody here not know who I am? Well, anybody who doesn't know who I am, obviously, my name's Guy Morin, and I'm a lifelong resident here of Auburn. And if you haven't guessed already, I really love history. Had a lifelong interest in it, and back when I was in high school, got involved in reenacting as a hobby. And over the last 33 years, I've become involved in reenacting 6 different time periods. Everything from King Philip's War, 1675, King George's War, French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And I've done probably half of those programs for society. So this evening I'm going to be talking to you about the French and Indian War. And French and Indian War actually is a little bit of a misnomer, because actually there's a series of French and Indian wars that take place between the end of King Philip's War in 1676 and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 or so. And the series of French and Indian wars corresponds with European wars. And normally what happens in the colonies is they name the conflict on this side of the ocean after the reigning monarch. So we have King William's War in 1689 to 97, Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713, King George's War from 1744 to 1748, and then it's another war, and we're going to name it after the monarch, but wait a minute, we've already got a King George's War. We're going to name this one, but we'll just call it the French and Indian War. People in the 18th century used to call it simply the Old French War. Some historians call it the War of British Empire. We know it as the French and Indian War, and I'm going to be talking tonight about that period of time, 1754 to roughly 1763. Now, what happens in 1754 is the French are moving into the western reaches of what's now the state of Pennsylvania. They build a small fortification called Fort Duquesne out of the confluence of the Ohio and Monongahela rivers, and of course this upsets the colonists. They say, we can't have the French this close. Of course, the French and the English both trying to expand their influence into the Ohio River Valley area, and the French get out there first. So they send a young Virginia officer of militia with a militia unit out to tell the French, you must leave. Anybody know who that young militia officer was?
George
Washington. This is where he gets his first military experience. So he goes out into the western reaches of Pennsylvania. He's a Virginian. Because Pennsylvania didn't have any military force. There was no militia in Pennsylvania until the French and Indian War. He is given the charge of building a road and telling the French, beat it. Well, he gets out to a point about 50 miles southwest of modern Pittsburgh, and his scout report, there's a French force a few miles away. So Washington goes with a small group of his militia and local Indians and surround the French, who are camped at a place called Drummondville Glen. He springs an ambush and kills them all except one. There's always the one that gets away. And that one that got away goes back to Duquesne and tells the French, the English are only a few miles away, you better do something. So Washington realizes when he gets the report that, of course, somebody got away, he has to tell the French that he's got to do something quick. So he builds a small stockade, which really isn't much, in a small earthwork fortification. But he puts it in the bottom of a bowl of a valley and doesn't cut back the tree line very far, and sets himself up to be besieged. And sure enough, the French come out, besiege him, and he surrenders. And this is the spark that ignites not only the French and Indian War here, but will also lead to the 7 Years' War in Europe and a worldwide conflict. This is going to there are going to be actions that take part all over the planet, from the small little skirmish in Drummondville Glen. Well, here in the colonies, it's an age-old problem of the French and the English colonists. And in 1754, with the war erupting again, it means that the provincials, the colonists themselves, are going to have to defend the colonies initially. In 1755, they begin to expand and begin their operations against the French. And the basic idea is going to be, for a military side of things, a three-pronged attempt to conquer Canada. They'll go out to the western reaches, the frontier. They'll go up the Lake George, Champlain Valley route to try and take the Canadian area there, and they'll go out to the maritime provinces and down the St. Lawrence River to try and attack that way. And that's the basic military strategy for the war. In 1755, this is going to be handled primarily by provincials in 2 of the 3 areas and by a small British force under Braddock on the 3rd. Braddock leads 200 strength regiments of infantry plus Virginia militia into the Pennsylvania wilderness. He's going to be ambushed short of his mission. The column is going to be scattered. They're going to be beaten back to Virginia. They fail in that mission. In the Champlain Valley, you have the Battle of Lake George in September of 1755, where Williams and Johnson lead a provincial expedition, and they're trying to establish a base at the bottom of Lake George when Deskew comes down and attacks that force, and the Battle of Lake George, surprisingly enough, becomes an American victory. And the American provincial forces go to what's down Nova Scotia and basically eject the Acadians and take over the lower part of what's now Nova Scotia. In 1756, the war erupts in Europe. American provincials again are going to be dispatched. This time, 2 regular British regiments are raised here in the colonies, the 50th and 51st regiments. They're sent out to Fort Ontario in what's now the modern city of Oswego, New York, and are promptly captured by French commander Montcalm. The other aspects of the campaigns pretty much stall. In 1757, the attempt is made to again operate in those 3 fronts. The most notable event in 1757 is going to be the attack on the British fortification at Fort William Henry at the bottom of Lake George. The British commander was Lord Loudon, and unfortunately for Lord Loudon, he believed he was the viceroy of the colonies. He attempted to force the colonies to kowtow to him. The colonial legislatures didn't. He was frustrated because the provincial soldiers weren't accepting the British military control over them, and the colonies weren't providing the troops, the money, and the supplies that he needed. So his campaign up the Champlain Valley failed, and he loses his outpost at William Henry. Things are going to change in 1758. The British government changes, and William Pitt comes to the position of Prime Minister. He changes how the British government is going to handle things. Instead of requiring the colonists to foot the bill, he's going to put a lot of British money into this, and this changes everything. And what he basically did was he said, on our dime, you're going to fight the war alongside us. So with this influx of British coin, which is going to rapidly expand the economies here in the colonies, it also allowed the colonies not to have to worry about paying out the money, and it immediately resulted in large-scale recruiting for the provincial corps. In 1757, Massachusetts put out fewer than 1,800 men in the field. In the winter of 1758, the Massachusetts General Court voted not to raise troops for the 58 campaign. But when word came that Pitt wanted to foot the bill, they suddenly said, well, we're going to change our mind here, and they voted to raise 7,000, and they met their recruiting goals. So in 58, the big campaign is going to be moved forward. Now the problem was, it's a little bit stymied in the western frontier. Forbes doesn't make it out to, he's the military commander trying to go out to take Duquesne. His attempt fails, but he will succeed the next year. In the Champlain Valley, Abercrombie's in command. He attempts to take Ticonderoga, slams his infantry into the French outer works, and fails miserably there. The bright spot, however, is on the maritime provinces where Wolfe and Amherst take Louisbourg. And with Louisbourg taken, now they threaten the gateway to the St. Lawrence and can control the Atlantic shipping route into Canada itself. The British are now going to be on the upper hand. One small event that takes place that oftentimes gets overlooked is Bradstreet's raid. Now Bradstreet was in charge of what were called the bateaumen. These are the guys who took care of servicing the boats and were the transport people for the armies. And what Bradstreet did was he launched an amphibious attack on Fort Frontenac, which was a small outpost, but it was a choke point on Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, rather. And Fort Frontenac was the supply chain headquarters for all the Western French outposts. And when he took this, he cut off all those Western outposts from their supply system. And that effectively reduced their ability to withstand attack. And that's why in the next year, Forbes takes Duquesne, the western areas begin to falter. They can't contribute very much to the support of the French army in the main part of Canada. And by 59, the noose is being slowly tightened around French Canada. In 59, the British move up the Champlain Valley. The French abandoned Ticonderoga. They abandoned their post at Crown Point. They start moving up the Richelieu River toward Montreal. The British come down the St. Lawrence. This is where Wolfe besieges and takes Quebec in September of 59. They also have an expedition that goes out and takes the French outpost of Niagara. That too had been weakened because of the Bradstreet raid. And by 1760, the remnants of French power are being crushed by the three-pronged attack on what's left of the French military forces in and around Montreal. So by 1761, it's all over. There's one small rally by the French to try and take some position and take and capture Newfoundland for a short period of time, but a combined force of provincials and regulars go up and knock the French out of Newfoundland, and the war pretty much ends. Now, the provincial forces, the guys that I'm representing tonight, these were the American force that's going to fight the war. Now, in the 18th century, you have militia, and militia are all men 16 to 60. But militia are not truly a combat force. Militia are a pool, and from that pool of soldiers, you would then recruit. So the way this worked is each year of the French and Indian War, the masked General Court would authorize the raising of troops. And using 1758 as the example, they authorized about 7,000 men, roughly 7 full regiments. And what they would do is they would call out the militia, and recruiters would go to these assemblies of militia and recruit. And normally they were well-known local officers. For example, in this area in particular, you had Timothy Ruggles from Hardwick, who led one of the regiments, and basically was a provincial officer throughout the war. And he will eventually become second in command in the 1760 campaign against Montreal, leading all provincial forces. Ruggles had an officer under him by the name of Ebenezer Leonard from Oxford. So there's a high probability that men living in South Parish, before there was a war, before there was an Auburn, there's a high probability he probably recruited several men from the village of South Parish. I don't have any evidence of this yet, and I haven't looked at the other recruiting because it wasn't all geographical. But since he's the nearest officer and was well known in this area, there's a very high likelihood some of our guys might have been in his company. So you knew an officer, and you decided, I will sign up with this particular officer and enlist in the service of the colony. You are in Ebenezer Leonard's company of Timothy Ruggles' regiment. And the mindset of the colonists was, I'm signing up for either a specific campaign, the taking of Ticonderoga, the taking of Crown Point or whatever, or a specific time, 9 months or 1 year. And the mindset was, it's a contract. Now this flies in the face of military doctrine for the British, because the British say, you're in the army, you live by our rules and our discipline. And that's the rub between the provincials and the regulars that's going to create the mindset and revolution of the Americans being worthless soldiers. On the British side, they think the Americans are worthless soldiers. There's no discipline. They're never going to be able to stand and fight. And the provincials saying that the British are basically a bunch of hard asses. So you would join your regiment and sign on for campaign or a particular time frame. Now, one thing that really irritated British regulars was that the provincial guys like me got paid nearly twice as much as they did. British soldier was paid roughly 8 pence per day. If you take your daily pay, your stipends for food and clothing, if you were receiving that particular year, per diems on travel, bounties for enlistment, and you add it all together, the provincial soldier is making virtually twice what a British regular would. and he's not going to be doing nearly as much combat, and he probably isn't going to be dealing with as much discipline. The provincial soldiers would be recruited. Many of them would go to a rendezvous point, gather their regiments together, and then march out the main roads westward. Now, oftentimes this was post roads, which today we know pretty much would be something like Route 20 and Route 9. That road diverges out in the Brookfields, and the southern route, which takes you down through Warren and out through Springfield, was the favored one. It's because that was the more developed part of the colony, and the per diem allowed you to stay in taverns. You ate better, you had better housing, you were more comfortable on your march out to Albany, and then eventually up into the Champlain Valley. That's where most Massachusetts troops will see action. The northern route goes out through Northampton and toward Pittsfield. It wasn't as well developed, and the choices weren't there. The men didn't, report as favorably on that route. Oftentimes you wound up going up through Albany and then marching toward Fort Edward, and that was the staging area for the campaigns up and down the Champlain Valley. Provincial soldiers, unfortunately, usually wound up in secondary roles. The British command structure didn't like using provincials because they thought they were ill-trained, poorly disciplined, not quality troops. They usually got stuck doing some patrol work, road construction, guarding and escorting supply trains, but this didn't mean that they weren't going to be attacked, and they oftentimes would see their combat there. Now, the way I'm dressed tonight is pretty much the sort of standard for provincial uniforms during the war. And if you look at your little flyer, there's the famous painting of Washington wearing virtually the same clothing. Blue coat, red facings. This was a common issue uniform when uniforms were available. 1754-55, uniforms really weren't available. Even in the Virginia regiment, they were wearing a red, what's called a frock coat. Right? The next year they went to the blue with the red. The provincial governments in 55, 56, 57 had to foot the bill. So oftentimes you weren't getting all this. Massachusetts was a little bit richer than most colonies. They could afford to outfit their troops a little bit better. And by 58, with the British government promising to pay the freight on all this, the uniforming improved. In some cases, your bounty for enlistment wasn't money, it was the promise of clothing. And oftentimes your coat was your bounty. That changes to money later on when the money starts flowing in from Britain. Other colonies who couldn't afford to outfit you had you assemble and serve wearing civilian clothes. So you'd see a mixture of clothing in the provincial camps and a mixture of equipment. Sometimes there were bounties offered not for just enlistment, but if you brought a blanket, if you brought a weapon, because weapons were in short supply. And not only did you use British weapons, you might use cast-off or battlefield finds of French weapons. You might find men using Dutch weapons or German weapons. Whatever was available and could be utilized was. And even regular units sometimes utilized cast-off enemy weaponry. So I have the provincial style coat, I have a wool vest, and I'm wearing wool breeches. I have full-length leggings, which are painted linen, 18th century style shoes. I'm carrying a military canteen. I do carry a haversack, which is where I carry my food supply, but there isn't a lot of information that suggests that provincials were going to be carrying these, which is a little bit strange when you know anything about military history, because that's your food bag, that's where you carry your rations. Your haversack and your canteen were two items you had to carry. Now, a haversack is considered camp gear, not personal gear. So why there's no record of these being issued in any quantity to provincials, I don't understand, because you had to carry 2 or 3 days worth of food, especially if you're on the move. I carry a cartridge pouch for ammunition. Up front I carry a cartridge box. This is a wooden block with a leather flap over. Most only receive the box, not the pouch. And also a waist belt where I carry a bayonet from a musket. I happen to have a military musket. And a very important tool for the campaign is going to be a tomahawk. Now, there are certainly going to be instances where tomahawks are going to be used as weaponry, but an awful lot of people are simply using these as camp tools. They're very practical and useful in camp. Now, the most important item, obviously, is going to be your weapon. And tonight I brought along the weapon I used in the Revolutionary War, which is virtually identical to what they were using in the French War for the British. As I've already mentioned, there was a hodgepodge of weaponry out there, And provincial soldiers in particular could wind up using almost anything. They could be using French, Dutch, German, English. They could be using American conversions. You know, one of the things American gunsmiths were doing was taking parts from all these different types of guns and assembling a functioning weapon. You could have a military musket, you could have a civilian fowler. As long as you had a firing weapon and you were reported for duty, a lot of times they accepted it, and in some years they offered bounties. And actually they did have years where they were purchasing civilian weapons for service. But tonight I'm carrying the British long arm. Now, this is referred to by most people today as the brown vest, but there's no evidence they were calling that in the 18th century. And actually what they were using in the French War was known as the long land pattern musket. This is the short land pattern musket that was common in the Revolution, and the difference is 4 inches of gun barrel and a few minor modifications to the furniture. But what they were doing in the French War was taking those 4 inches of gun barrel and cutting them off and shortening the stocks. So essentially, this is what they were carrying. It's a flintlock smoothbore musket. Flintlock meaning the mechanism is flint and steel that makes the gun work, and smoothbore, the barrel's a steel tube. What you fired out of it is a round lead ball that weighs about 1 ounce. It's roughly 3/4 inch across. Smoothbore weapons firing round ball are not very accurate. Whatever you're shooting at had to be less than 100 yards away. But the advantage was you could train soldiers to load and fire going through a 12-step loading process, and they could do that in training, for the British regulars anyway, in 15 seconds. In training, you had to fire 4 rounds a minute. The reality was in combat, you didn't often fire that fast. Oftentimes, in combat, 2 or 3 was pretty good, because in training, no one's shooting back at you. And you're not moving around. To load and fire your weapon, you had a paper tube cartridge containing a powder and ball in your cartridge pouch or cartridge box. The command would be given you to load. You would take the cartridge out, excuse me, bite the top of the cartridge tube off, put a little bit of gunpowder in the priming pan, close the steel on top of that, cast the weapon about, pour the gunpowder on the barrel, drop the ball down the barrel, crumple the paper up and stick that down the barrel. It was always important to put the paper in last, because the musket ball is made a little smaller than the barrel diameter. That way you can load quickly. But if you don't put the paper on top to hold it in there, when you point the gun at the enemy, the ball could roll out. You drew your ramrod, turn it around, put it in the barrel, and you ram the cartridge down to make sure the bullet was on top of the gunpowder. You turn the rammer, put it back in the channels, gun goes up, officer knows you're loaded, you're ready to fire. And the last 3 commands, I'm going to shoot Ken in the butt here. Make ready. Oh, that's all the way back.
Let's get the water for you.
Yeah, well, we shoot the water guy. Present, take a half step back to brace yourself, bring your weapon into your shoulder, and basically you point it toward the enemy. Now, they did take the men out shooting at marks. This is target shooting. The term marksman comes from this. And shooting at marks, you would use the front sight here, which is also the stud for your bayonet, as your front sight, and aim down the barrel. But in combat, linear formations were used in most combat for the major battles. And you simply point and shoot on command because you're trying to deliver as much ammunition on the enemy as quickly as you can. When you pull the trigger, this part goes forward. In the jaw is a sharp stone called flint. The flint strikes the steel scraping the steel makes the spark. It opens the steel. The sparks fall in the gunpowder. That burns quickly and shoots a flame into the barrel. Detonating the gunpowder charge, hopefully the ball goes off toward the enemy. Now, if everything's working correctly, when you pull the trigger, the gun goes off. There's no hesitation. But everything has to work correctly, and one thing you have to worry about is you can never let your powder get wet or damp, because wet powder won't burn. And if there's a thunderstorm in the middle of the battle, stops the battle, because all guns will stop working. Now, you do have one other weapon. You do, of course, have a bayonet. Not all provincials had bayonets. If you had a military weapon, usually it came with a bayonet. But not all provincials carried military weapons, especially if you had a civilian weapon. You would not have a bayonet to go with it. That's why you were required to have a secondary weapon of some kind of sword or tomahawk. Love this weather, don't you? Now, one problem the provincials have in particular is a lack of sufficient training. And the British complained about this constantly. there are instances reported over and over and over again of provincials arriving at the rendezvous camps never being issued a weapon, having no experience. Marching to Albany, marching to Fort Edward, still having no experience, never firing a weapon. There are a couple of instances that are recorded in diaries where guys were brought out on the range, it was basically a rifle range, but they didn't have rifles, to go target shooting and accidentally discharging the weapons and killing somebody. And there was an incident at Fort Edward that's recorded in one diary where they shot a British regular while going out shooting at marks, and that particular regiment was left behind to guard Fort Edward when the army went north to fight. A lot of the provincials had limited experience, and unless you had a period of time between rendezvous camp and arrival at Fort Edward to train up your regiment, you really didn't get a lot of experience built into your unit unless you re-recruit those men the following years. Now the NCOs and the officers usually had that experience, but a lot of the rank and file didn't. So there was a difficulty there, and that's part of what perpetuates the idea that American soldiers were worthless and why the British regulars didn't like using them. Now I mentioned provincial regulars, and that's what I'm representing, and this is basically a battalion soldier in the British Army, same thing. We fight in long straight lines because the basic idea is to deliver as much firepower on the enemy as quickly as you can. But when you talk about the French and Indian War, you can't talk about it without talking about Rangers, because that's one aspect of the French and Indian War a lot of people hear about. Rangers are a particularly American thing, and they were frontiersmen. And these frontiersmen, many of them from northern New England, had developed combat tactics from the end of the King Philip's War era all the way up to the French and Indian War. They knew how to fight the French and the Indians on their terms, in the wilderness, using irregular combat tactics and developing the idea of stealth and small unit groups, going on patrol, ambush, surprise, and using cover, and all the things we relate to the irregular combat that seeps into our idea of how the Revolutionary War is going to be fought. But if you've heard my British soldier talk, you know that's not really how it worked. Well, the most famous Ranger, of course, is Robert Rogers. And Rogers raises his companies and serves throughout the war, but he's not the only guy. And there's a number of different Ranger units that are going to be utilized in the Champlain Valley, in Nova Scotia, in the western parts of Pennsylvania, and they all operate the same basic idea, is frontier irregular combat. Now, they make a contribution, they're a significant part of the idea of reconnaissance and patrol and gathering information. One of the things that Rogers was always doing was sending patrols up the Lake George area and snatching a prisoner away from the French at Carouan, Ticonderoga. But in the real end analysis, the major battles aren't going to be fought with Rangers. They make an important contribution. There's an influence of Rangers in the British Army. The British decide they need their own Rangers, so they create what's called light infantry. Guys who can do the skirmishing and the patrol work and this kind of irregular combat. But it's partly because they so much dislike the Americans that they want their own guys with the regular discipline. The impact that the French and Indian War had on the Americans, I think it's nearly a third of the men eligible for service will serve in military units during the war. It has a major impact as an event that transcends everyone. At the end of the war, it's the pinnacle of the colonists' pride, I guess, in being English. When word comes that Quebec fell, there were wild celebrations in the cities like Boston. When word came that the French had capitulated at Montreal, there were wild celebrations. When word came that Havana had fallen in '62, there were wild celebrations. Just after the war, Massachusetts authorized the raising of funds to put up memorials to people like Augustus Howe, who had led British troops in the war. And there was this incredible sense of Britishness that had reached its zenith in 1763 that a mere 2 years later is going to collapse when we have the Stamp Act crisis and suddenly tumble into the fight for independence. So this is a real watershed event in the period of colonial history, and it overshadowed an awful lot by the American Revolution. Well, that's a lot of information, a lot of stuff I've been gibbering about, so I want to open this up and let you ask some questions. Here's your chance to talk to a 275-year-old guy. Who wants to go first? Yeah.
What do they do with the downtime besides write letters for home, just to take up time?
Well, there was a limited amount of letters home that I'm aware of, but they did keep diaries. Several men kept diaries, and there's an awful lot of this information you can glean. Downtime typically was, if you weren't on guard duty, if you weren't on patrol, you weren't drilling, you weren't doing work, and you were actually off duty completely, it was very simple camp activity you could do. You could work on your gear, you could work on cleaning yourself, cleaning your equipment, cleaning your uniform. You could take care of entertaining yourself with things like card games and singing and games in the camps. Occasionally they would send men out hunting. There are references to issuing 10 rifled weapons to each regiment to send out men hunting, to supplement with game to improve the diet a little bit. And there's some of that going on. But for the most part, the Army's going to keep you busy to keep you out of trouble. But very simple things, other than the usual routine of trying to keep yourself clean and healthy.
The uniform you have on, is that an officer's uniform?
No, this is a private. I'm a sentinel. Private. There's no decoration or anything to it.
How many uniforms did each person have?
You get one. You got one complete uniform. And not everyone got a complete uniform. Some colonies issued coats. Some issued coats and vests. Some had the whole thing. So there would be a mixture of clothing. Sometimes, I'm wearing a check shirt, which is civilian style, but also very common. Some guys would show up and have the coat, and then everything else would be civilian clothes. So you'd see a hodgepodge of clothing style, and sometimes a lack of uniformity among some provincial units. The provincials were at the tail end of the supply chain in the Army, so to speak. They got regular military cast-offs. So, for example, in camp, you oftentimes got old British tents, and they were worn out. That's why they were getting given to you. So oftentimes they leaked, they didn't work very well. So what a lot of provincials wind up doing is building other shelters. And there are sketches and paintings and descriptions of provincial camps that involve everything from building what they call wigwams, we call lean-tos, building arbors and brush huts, building what essentially are log cabins, and digging into the sides of hills, in fact, to build some kind of shelter. So there's a variety of things that are done to provide for the provincials, but they're at the tail end of the supply chain. So they're not getting all the best stuff. But this is a private's kit, and the only real distinction between my uniform and an officer's uniform, in most cases, would be gold trim and brass buttons or something. There wasn't much distinction.
Now the hat that you wear, what is the origin of the three-cornered hat?
Well, it goes back into the 17th century when the leaves, or the sides of the hat would be very round, and they started pushing them up to get them from flopping down. It's not a very practical hat. Let me tell you, it doesn't keep the sun out of your eyes, and it certainly doesn't keep the rain off your head. Now, one of the things that they did do, and we see orders for this in the regular Army and the provincials, is they would take these hats, uncock the hat, and cut the brim down to about a 2.5 inch wide brim all the way around. And what they gave them was a brimmed hat to shade them from the sun. It was a more practical headgear, and they looked like an army of roundheads. That's the description they use. But that was the style. That was the cocked hat of the French War, which is a little different than the Revolution, when the leaves, the way they cocked the hat in the Rev War, causes this to fan out a little bit more. It's a little wider in the back. So as I can tell the difference between a French War and a Rev War tricorn. Yeah, again.
There's rumor has it that there's a woman in Auburn that makes a lot of your uniforms. If that's true, could you tell us where do you get the patterns, and is that the actual material or close to it?
Yeah, I don't know anybody in Auburn who's doing it. I've got a guy out in Springfield that does mine.
Oh, okay.
He's another reenactor. The thing with this is we try to get as close to 18th century as we can. Now, there's a couple of difficulties with this. You can say it's 100% wool legally, and it's not 100% wool. That's the United States government. So it's as close to 100% as we can get. There's always going to be some man-made fiber in it, as far as we know, from the manufacturing process. But you're trying to get 100% wool and 100% linen, and you're copying originals. Patterns have been made off of originals. We look at original paintings, because we don't have photographs, obviously. There's a very small amount of original materials we can look at. You know, clothing in particular was worn until it was worn out, discarded, or reused. So there's a very limited amount of original clothing we can go to and look at. But by looking at originals and paintings and having someone with some professional skill draw up a pattern, then we can get the pattern, and they're commercially available now. And you can get 100% material, and you can make yourself, if you're skilled enough, the clothing. You're not going to walk into your local Walmart and buy this stuff off the rack. And believe me, the price I pay to have this stuff made, it's not Walmart. It ain't cheap. But everything that you see is reproduction. I mean, weaponry today, we get reproduction weaponry made either in Italy or India. I do leather gear. I make a lot of leather gear, so it's belts, cartridge boxes, that kind of stuff. I got my guy out in Springfield does clothing, but there are companies, people have started manufacturing this stuff. So when we go to reenactments, there are what we call sutlers who sell this stuff to us. So I can go to a sutler and buy either the parts, the buckles and the correct materials and the patterns, and have somebody make it, or I can in some cases find a tailor who's got ready-made stuff. So that's where we get the stuff. Yeah.
During this war, did you have two different uniforms for summer and winter?
You know,
So
one uniform.
Wool or summer?
Yep. It's toasty.
And how long does it take to load the...
You can go through the loading process normally in training 15 seconds. Typically in combat, it's closer to 20 seconds.
Amazing.
Yeah, you can do it that fast. Believe me, somebody's coming at you and you're trying to do that, yeah, you can do it real fast. You can do it real fast. Any other questions? Something else you don't know about?
Oh, yeah, I heard a story where that's where the Indians defeated some of that people. They'd send a couple out to get shot at, and then they'd rush them and tomahawk the guys.
Yeah, the typical ploy is, you suck them into an ambush.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't learn, because it's the same ploy that's used in King Philip's War, it's the same ploy that was used in Little Bighorn. I mean, it works every time. They see a few, they go chasing after them, you get drawn into an ambush and you ambush them. And they ambushed them with both tomahawk and firearm. Now, the Indians were being supplied by both sides. Both sides utilized them. But this was also a very brutal war. This was the culmination, really, of the brutality of 18th century warfare. This is where, all those great stories you hear about, the romantic version of war, down and dirty in the French Indian War was pretty brutal. I mean, this is tomahawking and scalping and decapitations and everything else. It doesn't get very clean. And everybody was doing it. There are diary entries that have Rogers on the expedition to St. Francis capturing an Indian woman and bringing her along on the retreat back. St. Francis is up in Canada, or in Quebec, and these guys were way away from any supply line, and they had to go overland back to get to the British lines. And the story that this one guy was a British regular serving in a Highland regiment who was assigned to go with Rogers on this expedition. Apparently Rogers was planning on utilizing the female captive as food. And it's one of the few instances where they relate cannibalism amongst the provincials. So, it was pretty cool.
The bayonet.
Yep.
At the Kid's Armory Museum, we have bayonets that come in different shapes. And I wondered if the bayonets that were used during the war were standard, or if they had different shapes.
In the 18th century, for the most part, they're triangular blade bayonets. You still have a handful that will pop up of the knife blade socket plug bayonets. In the late 17th century, as firearms are beginning to become more dominant and the pike is going aside, what you need is a weapon that can be both musket and pike. And that's what the bayonet really is. It gives you a secondary weapon. Now, in the 17th century, combat is mostly with pike and not with the firearm. So guys armed with muskets, if they couldn't fire any longer or were going into close combat, would draw out a long-bladed knife with a wooden stopper at the end of it and jam it into the gun. And this is going to be used in the first quarter, the first half of the 18th century as a bayonet as well. So effectively, you can't fire the weapon any longer with a plug bayonet, but you can use it as a pike, or you can use it as a spear. The socket bayonet comes in the early stages, the first quarter of the 18th century, and eventually becomes a dominant bayonet, because with a socket bayonet, it fits around the barrel, you can load and fire with the bayonet on. And now you have the ability to continue to fire. The weapons are a little more reliable. You can utilize that gunfire to weaken your enemy and then break the line with a bayonet charge. The idea of the triangular blade, and we used to tell the story, well, it's triangular to open up a three-sided wound and you can't close, you know. No, it's for strength. A single flat-edge blade, that length and that thin, would break. So for strength reasons, they made a thicker triangular blade here and tapered it down. And these are used well into the end of the 19th century. But basically, that's the style of bayonet you're going to see in the French War. For the most part, a triangular socket bayonet and a very limited amount of plug bayonets still kicking around. Mostly for much older guns.
How far do you travel doing reenactments?
Well, this year I'm going to Fortress Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. It's going to take me about 20 hours to drive to. And the opposite end, I'll be going to Gloucester Point, Virginia, over the other side of the river from Yorktown, to do a Red War battle. So I've gone everywhere from Louisbourg to Western Tennessee.
Have you ever been up at Crown Point?
Oh yeah, I go to Crown Point.
Yeah.
And
last year was,
This year in particular is the 250th anniversary for the big attack at Fort Ticonderoga and the siege of Louisbourg. So you're going to see two very large anniversary reenactments at those two sites. We're looking at somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 reenactors. For the French War, that's pretty big. That's about as big as you can get in the French War. But I've traveled, up and down the east coast of the U.S. and Canada doing these. I'm a little closer to home these days because I don't have quite the freedom I had 10 years ago, but no, I still do quite a bit of travel. And this year, like I say, Louisbourg is the big one. We're all done for that one. So I'll be going, that's the end of July.
When you do the reenactments and you go for any distance, do you pay for your own costs? Is there any reimbursement?
Sometimes there's reimbursements, but not very often. And most units, what we do is we take the money for any reimbursements and throw it into the unit treasury to buy communal items. This is a hobby, We go out, we spend the money, and we travel, we do this on our own, and we have a lot of fun doing it. Occasionally guys that I know who do this get hired to do some things, but for the most part, this is a hobby. So, it's my vacations, it's my time, my time away, and that stuff. Yeah.
On the tomahawk use, you were talking about using it in camp, but if you were pressed to use it in battle, was it pretty much held in hand, or did they actually throw it?
I'd say for the most part, you held on to it. You throw it, and that's it. It's gone. Looks great in the movies. Looks great in the movies. Check it.
Do you have any good stories of maybe being stopped by the police for speeding or anything like that with your outfit on? Or?
No, I haven't had that happen, but I get some very strange looks when I walk into McDonald's. I was in my Civil War kit one time, and I'm a sergeant in the Civil War, and I got a strike going down the leg, and I'm walking into a coffee shop, and this woman comes up and says, "Officer, officer." No good stories like that. But, you go to a lot of really interesting places, and you see a lot of interesting things. You get to stay in the place. You're not just visiting it and looking in the display cases. You're part of the site. We go to these places like Louisbourg or Fort Ty and camp on the sites, and you get to be there and experience it 24 hours. For 2-3 days sometimes, and really soak up the historical ambiance of the site. But you also get to see things every once in a while that kind of freak you out a little bit. If you want a good story, I was doing a Red War camp in Saratoga several years ago, and Saratoga is a national park, so they close and they lock the gates and you're in there. So there's not supposed to be anybody in the park roaming around. And we're sitting around our campfire out at the Freeman Farm site, and we can look out across this field, and we see a light. Now there's no road, there's nothing out there. We see a light. And we see another light come up to it, and the two lights walk away. That was a little spooky. And there's always the great ghost stories you hear about these sites. You go to these places, and you're reading the booklet that tells you about the ghost that's supposed to be in the well, the room next to you that you're sleeping in. You know, that kind of freaks you out a little bit. But you just go to these places and you get to be part of the site. You know, I've done things like I've camped at Fortress Louisburg, or I've camped on the front lawn of the Governor's Palace at Williamsburg, or I've been on the battlefield that, you know, you pick the battlefield I've been to. So that's the real interesting and fun part of reenacting, is you get to go to these places and actually be there, and be part of it, be part of the anniversary observances. So it's a real interesting thing to do. But it's a hobby, and it's mine. Yeah.
Couple of questions. What was the normal size of the group that was together? And they weren't together all the time because there seemed to be a lot of travel. And how did they provide the food? I mean, if you have too many people there, it's kind of hard to eat.
At Fort Edward, before Abercrombie launched his assault on Ty, he had what was effectively the second largest city in North America. And it denuded most of that area, which wasn't very heavily populated, of all the goods and food items that were there. So a lot of it was being produced and shipped up from Boston and New York and the other colonies to supply the army in the field. You lived primarily on salt provision, salt pork, some salt beef. Fresh meat on the hoof was brought into camp, and that was a big part of it. They would be driving cattle up the Hudson Valley to get them up to the forts, and one of the things that provincial units got stuck doing was being cattle drivers and escorts for these food convoys, is what they were. When you're moving a regiment from, say, Massachusetts out to Albany, they were probably being broken down by companies, because you couldn't send 500 to 1,000 men sweeping through and stay at one tavern. It wouldn't work. But 50 to 100 could be accommodated, you know, sporadically. So it was a combination of foraging a little bit, but because of the wilderness situation, most of it was supplied from the settled areas and the farms further south and east. But they had a food network, and they had to feed, you know, 10, 15,000 people on a regular basis. So, and that was in '58. You know, Abercrombie had a big army.
Was there a lot of people, a surplus of men at that time? Or I was just thinking, you know, later on, I guess there was too many men in an area, you know, the kids and everything, so employment and that sort of thing. But how did the people back home deal with the absence of these?
Well, most of the time, a lot of time, the guys that are going off to fight are in that 18 to 25 range. Some of the officer and NCO Corps were a little older, but you weren't denuding the entire population base of everybody in the 16 to 60 range. So oftentimes, the kid that was in that 18 to 25 range, he was the one that was going. And this is also his grub staking. This is his way to put up some money for his future. Particularly in a highly settled area where there wasn't the opportunity to subdivide the family farm because of all the kids. One thing that the provincial government did was they usually held your pay until end of service. You got a little bit of money when you joined, so you could outfit and you know, to get you going, but you weren't paid regularly in the field. There was no place to spend it.
What about land grants?
There isn't a lot of indication that they gave a lot of land grants, as much as the provincial soldiers that were going out and up the valleys were making mental and written notations of the area they were going through. Because what they would do is they would see what they were marching through, western parts of Massachusetts, and realize, when this is over, this is where I'm going to wind up buying my land and settling. And that's what happened. That's the westward migration here, and also in the Champlain Valley. And then after the French War is when you start seeing the expansion westward from Massachusetts, northward into New Hampshire and the New Hampshire grants. Anything else? Well, I'll stick around for a while. I want to thank you all. It's been a great audience. Hope you enjoyed the program. Yeah, Kenneth Roberts is pretty accurate, but remember it is historical fiction. The one that usually people will associate the French and Indian War with are movies, and it's Last of the Mohicans, which is a great love story, but not terribly accurate. You know, it's Last of the Mohicans is really, if you know anything about history, it's James Fenimore Cooper is writing about the 1790 kidnapping of Daniel Boone's daughters. And he's putting it in place names that are familiar to him, which is the French and Indian War up the Champlain Valley. The big story in the early part of the 19th century was Boone was a local hero. I mean, he was an American hero. And in the 1790s, two of his daughters were captured by Shawnee warriors and carried off. And that's basically the storyline. But Fenimore Cooper put it into the context of the French and Indian War and the great battles that he knew about. And of course, Hollywood grabs on that and they write this whole thing up. And if you watch the modern story, a lot of it's just not that accurate. The other one that a lot of people, and you got to be a movie lover, is Northwest Passage. If you ever saw Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy and Robert Montgomery, it's a great movie for action and adventure. It's not entirely accurate, you know, but. You know, John Ford did a pretty good job with it in terms of the French War and what was happening in certain respects, but it's just, as a reenactor, when I watch movies, I'm ripping everything apart. Oh, they didn't have that gun, and no, that uniform was 3 years before after that. No, they didn't do that kind of thing. You sit there, and I'm also looking at all my friends, because we get hired out to do movies occasionally. So, hey, there's my buddy going over and getting killed. Yeah, there's another guy falling off the down. I see that stuff all the time. So, unfortunately, Hollywood has to make a story that sells, makes money, and accuracy isn't always part of it. And the same thing with historic novels. Historic novels are going to make money, so they're not 100% accurate. But somebody like Kenneth Roberts was amazing because he actually did a lot of research to write his series. So, okay, well, I'll stick around if you want, and I'm sure you guys have other things you'd like to do. So, have that.